it's LaShawn Johnson. I'm a faculty here at Creighton in the Department of Clinical Research and Public Health. And this is the second of our conversations for the Sick and Tired project. We've been really lucky in that we've been able to have really good conversations with you in the community and really good conversations with our experts. And so we have another one today, and I think this one is a great continuation from the first conversation we had, and I hope that it helps you as you're sitting around the table this spring and summer for family barbecues and other kinds of gatherings, that you can start to use what we're learning today to start some conversations with your own family and friends. So I'm here with Alicia, and we're just going to have a conversation today, just like we would with two friends sitting together. And so take a look at what we're doing and the resources we'll share, and hopefully you'll get some ideas about how you might start a conversation with your loved ones and how you might be an agent for change in your community and the folks that you live with and work with and go to church with and all of those things. So hi there, thank you for coming and hanging out with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's really good to see you, and it's really great to be able to have this conversation face to face. So many of us have been not able to have our conversations face to face because of everything that's going on.
Right.
So it's great to see you and great to be able to talk to you about all of the things. So first, just tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what brings you to this work and why it's exciting for you.
Yeah, so my name's Alicia Gentry, and so I am a licensed independent mental health practitioner. I'm currently in private practice, have my own practice. It's called Inner Work Counseling and Consulting. And we kind of specialize in working with more so of like attachment and trauma, as well as like couples and families. And so what really got me into the work is prior to becoming a therapist, I worked in child welfare for about 4 or 5 years as a family permanency specialist, and meeting with my families and like working with them one-on-one. You know, it was more from a social work aspect of putting services in place and working with the family to preserve the family and, you know, just trying to make sure that they were well connected and supported. But in doing that work and meeting with them one-on-one, I found that a lot of the work I was doing kind of started to feel like therapy, because I was just more invested than just going in and putting in services and having other people, you know, come in. So I was really like getting to know the families, trying to understand their stories, really connecting and relating to them, and really trying to mend some of the brokenness that I was seeing in families. And so kind of going back a little bit, I had started my bachelor's degree in psychology because I've just always had a passion and an interest in like people's stories and why people think the way they think and why they show up in the world that they do. And so I've just always had that interest, but I didn't continue with my psychology major. But then obviously just through life experiences and the work, it brought me right back to it. And so while I was working as a case manager, I decided to go back and to get my master's in clinical mental health. And now, you know, that is what I'm doing, and I absolutely love it. And I'm so passionate about working with families, especially Black families, but all families really. And I'm very, very passionate about trauma.
Okay. Thank you. So actually, you just used the word trauma that I think people have heard, but I don't know if they always know what that means. So what do you mean when you say you're passionate about trauma? What is trauma?
So I guess I'm passionate about working with people that are impacted by trauma. And so, you know, I think a lot of people are very familiar with like post-traumatic stress disorder. We call that PTSD. And that is a form of trauma, but that's more so like, I think a lot of times people associate it with car accidents or war. You know, we know that a lot of veterans have PTSD, but PTSD is more so about a single event. Whereas when I talk about trauma, I'm thinking of like complex trauma, childhood trauma, and those are more so things that we've experienced, but on a continual basis, you know, so it's like cumulative trauma. And it's also a lot of things that a lot of times we don't even notice or acknowledge as trauma because they can be very subtle, but it's more so about the reoccurrence of that and just how it starts to impact us. And so one way that we look at trauma is that it can be anything that just kind of overwhelms someone's capacity to cope. And so because of that, trauma can be subjective. And so what may be traumatic to you may not be traumatic to me, and vice versa. But it really is about the way that the trauma gets wired into our systems, how we internalize it. And so then trauma becomes one of those things that the memories get locked into us. It affects our self-concept. It affects our relationships. It affects the way our brain functions. It just ultimately changes and shifts the way that we show up in the world.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I feel like that word gets thrown around a lot, and I don't know if everyone knows what it means. So.
Yeah. And I think there's a difference too when someone's like, wow, that was really traumatic versus like actually having a trauma. You know, like it's okay if you're like, oh my God, I was just in the store and it was so overwhelmed and that was so traumatic, you know, versus like this trauma, you know, that actually happened. And so, I mean, it is one of those words that I think has become more mainstream. But yeah.
So that was really helpful to think about trauma and the way we've used that word around in the community. And it's helpful to know that there's like a clinical or diagnostic category for trauma, and then some things that are often just bad or stressful that happen. So with that in mind, I know that in our community, we've had folks whisper and be quiet about maybe someone's taking a medication and or seeing someone like a counselor, and ultimately we find out that maybe they've got some kind of diagnosis. So can you talk a little bit about how all of that happens? So if a loved one comes to you and says that they've got this diagnosis and they're seeing someone, or they're actively working to change some behaviors, or maybe they're even taking a medication, can you explain a little bit to folks who might be new to this? Like, what does all of that mean?
So one thing I'll touch on, which is what you first talked about, is like the diagnosis with trauma. So we do have post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which is in the DSM-5, and that's just kind of like a mental health Bible that we as therapists use, that we look at like different symptoms and things like that, criteria that help us to be able to really diagnose this person based on certain criteria being met. There isn't one for complex trauma, unfortunately, although there is a lot of work being done, a lot of research being done to try to develop a diagnosis for that. I mean, again, a lot of therapists, we support it, we recognize it, but unfortunately there's still more awareness, more work to be done in terms of actually getting official diagnosis. So if people were to go see, and because I'm a trauma-focused therapist, what that means is any client that I see, I'm viewing them through the lens of their trauma, you know, to where I may believe that everyone has experienced trauma, some on different levels, but as a trauma-focused therapist, you know, if someone is dealing with depression or anxiety, not to say that they may not to say that they don't have anxiety or depression, but as a trauma-focused therapy, I'm trying to understand more about the life events, the stressors, the traumas, because had those things not take place, I may be of the belief that they wouldn't even have anxiety or depression. You know, that anxiety and depression is a response to some of these very detrimental experiences that people have had in life. And so if you do go see a therapist, and again, they may not give you complex trauma, but that may be knowledge that they have in the back of their head of what they're dealing with, to where, you know, there are diagnoses that we can kind of use that still help us to kind of put it as a trauma disorder, but it may not specifically be complex. So just in case if anyone does follow up with their therapist, there may not be specifically a diagnosis for complex trauma, but we are well aware that it is truly a thing and something that a lot of us suffer from. So being that there are so many mental health diagnoses, there's so many approaches. And I think that a lot of times when people think about therapy or going to see a therapist, they think about talk therapy, which is kind of what we're doing right now. We're just engaging in a conversation. And while that is a part of it, um, therapy is much more than just talking about what's happening with us. And there's definitely benefits to that, but obviously, we can talk about therapy or our symptoms with loved ones, and it still may not alleviate, or give a reduction in the depression and anxiety. And so when it comes to the different approaches or modalities that we have, I won't go into all of them, but there are some that are specifically for trauma, and then there are other ones that, you can kind of just choose based on what you're looking for. So one that is really, well known is what we call CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And that one is just more so it focuses on understanding the relationship between our thoughts and our feelings, and then ultimately our behaviors. And so if you go to see a CBT therapist, you're going to spend a lot of time really examining like your thoughts. Is the way that you're looking at this helpful or unhelpful? What are some of the core beliefs that you have? These are some of the beliefs that are just at our core that we truly, really believe based on, again, life experiences that we may have had. And we're going to try to see if that core belief, is helpful, or is it in some way contributing to some of the suffering that we're experiencing? And if it is, can we maybe try to challenge that core belief? Can we try to find a belief that maybe serves us better? Another thing that we look at with cognitive behavioral therapy is we're going to look at like just our thinking patterns. And we call those cognitive distortions, if I am throwing out a fancy word. But the thinking patterns are just more so when we engage in a way of thinking, how does that affect our feelings? For an example would be catastrophizing, to where am I looking at things as though it's like it always happens this way or it never happens this way? Another thing is I always tell my clients to be really careful about the use of should, that when we say things should be this way, unfortunately that can be a very rigid way of viewing things. And as a result, it can make us feel like we're inadequate or we're not enough. If I believe that this should be this way and then I'm not measuring up to that, that's not giving a lot of room for grace or for life circumstances. And so again, some of these thinking tendencies that we can fall into can create just perfectionism or people-pleasing tendencies. So you're really just gonna explore all of that and try to find, what is a better way that I can look at this, or how can I start to redirect my thinking when I am being flooded by a lot of negative thoughts. So then the next one is what we call DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy. That one is pretty wide known, and it's one that a lot of people kind of, like I'll have clients call me and actually ask, am I a DBT therapist? And so that one can really help to treat PTSD, anxiety, depression. It was originally developed for people with personality disorders, but with DBT, it's more so about enhancing people's capability for behavioral skills. And so with DBT, there's 4 components, so if you're working with a DBT therapist, they're going to teach you more about mindfulness. And that's just about how to mindfully observe your emotions, without getting so caught up in them, without distracting from them, but just being present with whatever emotion is coming up. The next one we're going to look at is emotional regulation skills, just how we regulate our emotions, whatever emotion that is. So we're looking at our beliefs about emotions, how we experience emotions, how we respond to them. And so we're going to make sure you have the proper skills to regulate any emotion that you may encounter. The other one is distress tolerance skills. When you're experiencing distress, what are some ways that you can really help to increase your tolerance and be able to get through the moment without becoming overwhelmed by it. And then the last one is interpersonal effectiveness skills. And that's just, again, how do we experience conflict? How do we handle relationships with other people? So it's kind of looking at like our expectations for others, but then also how do we get our needs met in terms of being assertive? So it really touches on 4 key areas in life that really help us to have like good meaning in life and ensure that we have a good relationship with ourselves, but also others. And so DBT is one that is a good foundational therapy, for a lot of people, that even I would say you could start off with this therapy before you even go into maybe working with some type of trauma therapy, because when you're dealing with the trauma therapy, you want to make sure that you have the right skills to regulate your emotions that may come up. And so this is just a good foundational therapy that works with a lot of different symptoms. The one thing about DBT is you can either do it individually or there are a lot of groups. And the group aspect is really helpful because, again, it helps you to not feel like you're alone. You get to find other people that may relate to you, gain other ideas from how other people cope with things. Some people do a combination of individual and group. So there's just different therapists out there. But DBT is also more structured. So if you're someone that really likes structure, opposed to going into therapy and not really knowing what to expect, each session and just kind of playing it by ear, DBT has a very structured part of it, and there's a lot of homework involved because, again, we want to ensure that what you're talking about, what you're learning in therapy is actually being applied in real life. And so that's where homework and things like that come into play. So there are some other therapy approaches that are really beneficial for trauma. And so one of them is EMDR, which is probably one of the most well-known one. It's been around for a while. It is an evidence-based practice. And so that one's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And so with that one, you are reprocessing some of the traumatic memories that you have, but you're really focusing on some of the core beliefs that may have developed as a result of that. As I stated earlier, that when you constantly endure trauma, it really affects like your self-concept, your sense of safety. And so as a child, you may start to believe that like you're not safe or that you're not loved or that you're not important. And that becomes a core belief. And as a result of that core belief, that affects how we start to show up in the world, and it affects the way that we believe other people think about us. And so when you are with the EMDR therapist, we're going to start to try to identify what are some of these core beliefs that maybe are increasing your emotional suffering as a result of the traumatic experiences that you may have had. And so what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to install new beliefs, of like, what would you have liked to believe? What would have been more helpful to believe? Another part of it, which is the eye movement part, an EMDR therapist will kind of track your eye movements back and forth. And so that's just because there is a belief that like where we look kind of holds different parts of our traumatic material. Okay. And so it'll use this kind of tracker. It's like an eye movement tracker. And again, depending on your therapist, some therapists may just work on the installation of the proper beliefs, and other therapists may also do that part of it. And so then there's another one, which this one is not evidence-based. It's probably one of the newest forms of trauma therapy, but it's called brain spotting. And this one is very similar. It's derived from EMDR, but EMDR is more of a structured one, kind of like I said with the DBT, that there are certain steps that a therapist will go through, where brain spotting, it's just more gentle. It's more kind of based on the client chooses, what issue they want to work in session. And then based on that, we have what we use as a pointer. And so in a session, there's this fixated eye movements. And so what we'll do is we'll take the pointer and we'll kind of bring it across your visual field. And as it's going across and you're kind of tracking it, it's going to look at like any reflexes in the face, to see, does your eye start to blink really, really fast? Is there any twitching? Does your breathing get shallow? And so what that is going to indicate is that there's a brain spot, and a brain spot is just linked to any traumatic material. And that's the difference with the trauma approach. Opposed to like CBT and DBT, those are more kind of top-bottom approaches because they're really focused more on cognitive. But when you're dealing with trauma, we want to look at bottom-up because trauma really is stored in the body. There's a lot of physical sensations, a lot of images, a lot of muscle memory that is associated with trauma. And so with brain spotting, we're really focusing on like, as we identify a brain spot, and as you start to kind of focus, on that brain spot, looking at whatever direction, where we may have a fixation for your eye movement, then we're going to have you kind of start to notice what sensations are happening in your body as you recall that traumatic material. And so as you're focusing on that material, you're just going to notice any sensations, whether it's in your stomach or in your body. And what we're going to have you do, which is kind of different than what we typically do, sometimes I've noticed that like if I'm talking about something and I can notice my breathing is getting shallow, I can notice that I'm getting anxious. What we typically do is we continue to push past it, where brain spotting slows that process down, and it helps us to acknowledge the sensations that are happening in our body. And that's a way of releasing that energy that is trapped in our body that's associated with that. It also has us to get more curious about what is happening, like, what does this mean that when I'm thinking about this childhood memory that I start to experience, this sensation in my stomach, or maybe my brain gets foggy. And so again, the more that we acknowledge it and we really sit with it, we allow it to be released rather than it staying trapped in our bodies. And so that's another strategy for really healing trauma, is looking at it from a more bottoms up approach as we're focusing on the body. And there's a few other ones like that. I won't go into detail, but there's like somatic experiencing, which is very similar as well. Another one that I will kind of touch base on is what we call internal family systems. And I really like this one because it is a non-pathological form of therapy. So it does not deal with diagnoses at all. And the main reason is due to the shame that a lot of us experience when we are labeled with having depression or bipolar or borderline personality. And this is a trauma therapy as well. So it does kind of believe that, again, based on what we're experiencing is a result of what we have experienced in life. And so with internal family systems, it just believes that we have sub-personalities, not multiple personalities, but we have sub-personalities, which just means that we all have different parts of ourselves. And so as a result of some of these traumas and these experiences that we've had, that I may have a part of me that carries a certain burden or a certain memory. And so with IFS, it's working to really understand, the pain of this part, to where it doesn't believe that there are any bad parts. A lot of times we can look at certain behaviors, like substance abuse, or people that binge eat, or maybe self-harm, that there can be a lot of like shaming and criticizing, for those behaviors. With internal family systems, we don't look at it that way. We understand that had this part or this person not experienced this, that again, these behaviors that we're doing is just a way to cope with the pain, that these are ways that we are showing up and that we are responding to a lot of the hurtful things that we've experienced, that we've endured, that we haven't been able to release. And so in working with an IFS therapist, it's really going to teach you about how to be more curious about your experiences, how to be more compassionate, how to just be more caring for yourself. And so as you acknowledge some of these parts in yourself and really try to understand the stories that each of these parts carry, that you can release that burden. And then that part, no longer has to carry that pain and can then transform into the way that it needs to be. Because a lot of these coping strategies can be outdated, that a lot of times, what worked well for us in childhood in terms of how we learned to cope with it, that it was competency. It wasn't a matter of pathology or that you did something wrong. You're trying to survive really harsh conditions. And as a result of that, you learn to cope with it the best way you knew how. The thing that I think can sometimes start to be a problem is that as we get into adulthood, that some of those ways that helped us to survive childhood may be a hindrance in adulthood. And so IFS helps us to kind of acknowledge that and to try to alleviate those parts of us that maybe are still operating, in the past. And so yeah, there's just so many different ones, and without going too much into detail and boring, but there are just so many other than just traditional talk therapy that can really kind of move at a faster pace, because if we just do traditional talk therapy, it can help with self-awareness, it can help with self-understanding, it can help with creating our story and our narrative. But then after that, people are kind of stuck with like, what do I do with this pain? How do I transform it? What are the skills that will, help me to move past this? And that is where you may need more of a specialized approach, based on some of the ones that I mentioned. And then there's so many other ones out there as well.
So can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So with the internalized family systems, you're still doing that on your own, or do you bring in your family to talk about some of those things?
No. So yep, you're doing it on your own, because what internal family systems is is more so it's thinking of your system within yourself and seeing those as a family, you know. So like you may have a part of you that's really anxious, but then you may also have a part of you that is really depressed. And so all of these parts make up your own internal family system. And so we're trying to understand all the parts of your internal family system that are making you, you know, who you are. And so like there are 3 specific ones that they call, like, so the parts of you that may be carrying a really bad memory, like maybe you were sexually abused. And so we call that an exile part. That's a burden part. That's a part that's carrying a burden. And then we have what we call a manager. And so that's the part of you that helps you to function in life. So sometimes as a result of this sexual abuse and how people start to think of themselves, you know, because you tend to blame yourself, you start to feel really unsafe. So a lot of negative self-concepts develop as a result of sexual abuse or physical abuse. So we have this manager part that affects like how we show up in the world, because we want to still ensure that we're functioning. So the manager part may be the part of us that is a perfectionistic, you know, that we avoid pain by always overachieving or by being the very best or by being a people pleaser. You know, that if I people please, you know, people will love and accept me, and that's a way to avoid being rejected or abandoned. And so we don't look at those as bad or negative things. Those are survival, you know, techniques. Those are the ways that we're showing up in the world to avoid any more pain. And then the last one is what we call a firefighter part. That's the part that comes in. It's more impulsive and more reactive, because as much as you can be a perfectionist, as much as you can people please, while it helps to manage it, there's still going to be some pain that you're going to experience in life. And so when that pain does come up, we have this firefighter part that comes in to try to help us to cope with it, you know. And so that can be, some people tend to distract a lot from their pain as a way to escape it. Some people numb. And then you also have some people who end up using drugs, who binge eat, who may be overspenders or develop a sex addiction. Those are the firefighters, because those parts are coming in to help to alleviate the pain, to push it as far away as possible, to ensure that we can continue to function. And so as a part of IFS, we want to recognize that the only reason these managers and firefighters exist is because of the exiles, the parts that are carrying some of those burden, traumatic memories. And if we deal with that, and we recognize the story of those parts, it can transform into a more functional part, and then there won't be a need for, you know, the managers or the firefighters.
This has been a really helpful section of our conversation for folks to get a sense of some of the modalities that are out there, and none of them sound really scary or painful.
Yeah.
They sound like they can be modified to fit where the person is in their life and what's going on. And I hope that that's helpful for folks who are watching to see that there are lots of options out there. It's no one size fits all.
Right,
And
yep.
sounds like you can try something, and if it doesn't work, there are lots of other things that you can try to find the right fit for you.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been a client of brain spotting. I've been a client of EMDR. I've also been a client of IFS, you know, and I think each and every one of those modalities has helped me, you know, to get to a different place. Where some people may go in and that modality may kind of just be the only one that they need, and they may not need to go, you know, and experience a different modality. And so again, it really is just about what you feel comfortable, what your symptoms are, what ultimately aligns with like what makes the most sense for you. And so for those particular ones, those are the ones that make the most sense for me. And so in Nebraska, we do have a lot of EMDR therapists. Brain spotting is also increasing. There are several that are familiar with IFS as well, and CBT and DBT. So again, you wouldn't have a problem really finding a therapist here that specializes in at least one of those, if not multiple.
So I want to say how much I appreciate that you just said that you've been a client yourself, because my next question was actually about stigma.
Yeah.
So I know that, like I said earlier, folks are sometimes whispering about maybe someone has a diagnosis or they've had something happen.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of stigma in our community, and I know we've talked about this in some of our other videos, but did you have anything quick you'd like to say for folks who might be worried about the stigma or might have heard something said about what, folks who decide to see a therapist or be part of a support group or however they find to help them become the best versions of themselves?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just that, again, we're all familiar with the stigmas. We know that they're all out there. And really the only way that we can start to challenge, or combat them is to go against, what we've been led to believe, all our lives. And to know, too, just as many people that may believe in the stigmas and may reinforce the stigmas, there's just as many people who don't, who actually believe in mental health and who recognize it and who are walking this journey with you. And so just kind of, I guess, knowing that, because when you're dealing with mental health, because, we hear so much about how it is something that we shouldn't talk about, or it's something that isn't real, or it's something to be embarrassed about, it can feel very lonely, and it can feel very isolating. And also knowing that that you're not alone in that, that there really are people who are going through similar, if not the same things, and that, that's the whole purpose of like support groups. And that's why I'm an individual therapist. I don't do much group therapy, but I really do promote group therapy because it really does help to battle some of those things that we believe and that we hear. That when you go to group therapy and you get to see that other people are affected by some of the same things that you are, that you get to learn that it's just not me. And that is why, as well, as a therapist, I'm supposed to only self-disclose when it's appropriate or when I feel that it would be beneficial to my clients. And I do that, mainly because I know that sometimes there can be this power differential between me and the client, and they can view me as the expert or, and so to help them to realize that, no, like I'm not an expert. I'm much more human than I am therapist, and that some of the same things that they are struggling with, that they are dealing with, that I have dealt with it as well, which you'll find a lot of therapists are therapists due to what they have experienced in their lives. And either they had therapists that supported them and so they want to do that for others, or they felt alone in their journey and now want to be a safe space for others. And so in destigmatizing some of those myths, I think that when clients do decide to go to therapy, we as therapists get to help to empower them, and help to kind of challenge some of those beliefs they carry. And then I think sometimes that helps them to feel a bit more comfortable and a bit more stronger to then go into their own social groups and their own families and kind of start to have those conversations. And so, yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate that and your willingness to share part of your journey and part of your experiences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I have absolutely no shame when it comes to mental health. I believe that we all have mental health, and it's on a spectrum. Some of us are experiencing mental wellness, but we've all had times in our lives where our mental health has suffered.
I mean, thank you for being willing to share like your part of the journey, and also reminding folks that none of us are experts here. We're all learners, and we're all on our own journey, and that's the reason to have these conversations in the community, and that's the reason we bring folks like you to share some of your experiences and some of your knowledge. And but I think it's really helpful and less intimidating to see that you're saying, I'm not an expert here. I think that folks, at least some of the folks we've talked to, have been really nervous and intimidated about talking about mental health, and this is really great that you're sharing this with us and sharing your journey. So one of our questions that we have had in the community, so like I said, we've been encouraging folks to have conversations around the table and during the holidays, and I'm sorry. Can I start that over? Sorry. Okay. I don't know. It's like spam call. One of the things we've been doing in this project is really trying to encourage people to start those small conversations around the table during holidays, maybe after services. And so I wondered if you had any advice for our viewers about how to talk to a loved one about a diagnosis they may have, or diagnosis that the loved one might have, or maybe a conversation they've had with someone who's considering going to see a therapist or some specialist to talk about something that's come up for them. Any advice for how to start those conversations, or to ask someone about how they're doing?
Yeah. So in regards to like how to start the conversation, I don't know that there's a right or wrong way, other than obviously the conversations just need to be had, you know, and they're not going to be perfect. But at least we're at a place now where we're starting to have the conversation, you know, opposed to when we weren't talking about it at all and we're suffering in silence. And as a result of that suffering in silence, shame is getting the best of us. And so I think the most important part is just that we're starting to have the conversations. But I would say that for some clients, when we've talked about, you know, their mental health and the things that they're dealing with and just how lonely and isolating it can really, really feel, that there have been times where they will bring, you know, a family member into session. And as a result of that, again, I'm still allowing them to have the conversation because I want them to, you know, gain the tools and the confidence to be able to share, you know, their story. But I'm there to kind of facilitate a safe space, you know, to ensure that, you know, while they're having this conversation, you know, that both people are having a chance to talk, but there's no interrupting, there's no insulting language. And maybe, again, there are some things that maybe I may have to summarize or help the person understand, like, what this person is really trying to say. And just, again, kind of keeping control of the emotional temperature that may be in the office. And that has typically worked really, really well. Again, I mean, I'm facilitating, but I also may provide some psychoeducation in addition to my client sharing their story. And I can honestly say I don't think that I've ever had it go wrong. So that is one option. Another option is I think that if people want to have these conversations, that it's all about finding the most safe person to first have it with. As practice for yourself, you know, to where if you're not used to sharing this information, you're not used to talking about it, so maybe you don't know how to language it. You want to start with someone who is safe, you know, someone that you know isn't going to judge you, they're still going to love you. And that can just be practice so that as you start to have the tougher conversations that you've already gained some experience and you're learning what you want to say, but you're also getting to better understand how you're going to show up in that conversation, what emotions are going to come up, you know, in terms of being aware of your body sensations and things like that. So it's just really good practice. And so as you start to have those conversations with a safe person, then you can kind of move on to the next person. And if possible, maybe that safe person can be with you when you're having the conversation with other people, you know, and not as like a 2-on-1 kind of thing. They can just be there as more of an emotional support, and also as a way to facilitate the conversation as well. And so I think that's, you know, a really good way as well, because if you're like, hey, I really want to have this conversation with my mom, but you know that like your mom maybe has some disdain for mental health, doesn't believe in it, or you just heard maybe conversations that your parent or your sibling has maybe shared, you just don't want to start with them because that's going to be very triggering, that's going to be very dismissive. And if that is your first conversation and it doesn't go well, that's probably going to stop you from having any future conversations, you know. So if you start with more of the safe people and you have more success there, that's just going to help to increase your confidence and your hope that can maybe carry you into the more harder conversations. Another thing that I would kind of say too is in any of these conversations, you really want, I think, to focus on, you know, what goals do you have for the conversation? I think sometimes we go into conversations expecting to be understood, expecting for people to agree with us, expecting that they'll, you know, leave this conversation and they'll, you know, see it differently or they'll understand you. And that's not something we can control, you know? And so when you have those type of expectations for the conversation, it can be very disappointing, you know? But if I have an expectation that I'm just gonna go in this and I'm gonna share my truth, or I'm gonna go in it and I'm going to be willing to understand, or I'm going to hear this person's point of view, or I'm going to stay emotionally regulated, or, you know, as long as your goals are set on what you can control, you're more likely to have a better conversation. Because if I go in expecting this person to understand or to validate my emotions, and when they don't, that's probably going to be very triggering, you know? And then once those emotions start to come up, there's a chance the conversation can go in a different direction. So I really think it's important to know what our goals and our intentions are, you know, for the conversation.
Is it okay to write those down and have them with you when you're
Oh,
in the
absolutely.
conversation?
Yeah, because these conversations can bring up a lot of emotion and a lot of anxiety. And one thing we know is that when we're experiencing anxiety, it shuts off the cognitive part of our brain. And so as a result of that, I may not be able to think clearly, my mind may go blank, the emotions are going to take over. And so as a result of that, if I have, you know, it written in my phone, or I have a piece of paper there, even if I forget or my mind goes blank, I have something that can still help to keep me present. And so it's like whatever you need to do, you know, there's not a right or wrong way to kind of prepare for this. And so I actually encourage, you know, my clients to write things out, to maybe practice this beforehand, say it in the mirror. I mean, whatever you need to do. And I think sometimes we think these things sound silly, but it's a lot of times exactly what we need in order to prepare, in order to practice. You know, like I'll sometimes share with clients, you know, if you're a basketball player and you're going into a basketball game, you don't shoot a jump shot for the first time in the game. You practice beforehand, you know, whether it's by yourself or with the team. You practice, you get the support, you perfect that jump shot so that you have a better chance of making it in the game when emotions are high. And that's the same thing for some of these conversations, because our emotions can get the best of us, you know. Also knowing that when you're having these conversations, that if someone says something that is triggering, being able to stop, you know, take a deep breath, step away, you know, obviously letting them know that you're not just leaving the conversation, but just saying, hey, you know, I just need to take a moment, going out and having a breather, whatever you need to do, and then being able to come back to the conversation, because every conversation is not going to go well. Every conversation is not going to be what you expect it to be, but it can, as long as we continue to, you know, stay in pursuit of whatever it is that we're hoping to accomplish. So.
Thank you. I mean, that's really helpful for those of us who are more experienced or less experienced with having these conversations. You've given us some really good tips about writing things down, setting our expectations,
Yeah.
you know, working with the person we're talking to. So as we sort of close out this really great conversation, I mean, we're so grateful to have you here. Do you have any suggestions for resources or books or websites that folks who are starting this journey and trying to work their way up to having these conversations and maybe making that appointment? We've got a mix of those folks in our audience who are just dipping their toe in and realize there's something they want to address so they can be their favorite version of themselves. Any recommendations for helpful tools that you see out there that folks could look at to help educate themselves or their families about the journey they're about to start? Or
Yeah, so some of those resources would be, I mean, for Black women is Therapy for Black Girls. It's a podcast, but then they also have, like, on her Facebook page, it's an open discussion to kind of talk about the information, and they touch on, I mean, everything that is Black mental health related. So you would learn more about anxiety, depression, all the different diagnoses, different forms of treatment, and then also be able to engage in conversations through social media. So that's been a very, very helpful one that I know a lot of my clients have really benefited from, and just learning a little bit more, because you know, there's only so much you're going to learn in therapy with your therapist, that we do have to take responsibility for getting more information and understanding what's going on. And so I think Therapy for Black Girls does a really good job of equipping us with the information and knowledge we need to further our journeys. There's also blackmentalwellness.com. And so that one just has different like coping strategies. It also goes into more depth about anxiety and depression. And I think those things can be helpful because I think sometimes people tend to self-diagnose, that they have depression or they have anxiety. And there's a difference between, we all feel anxious at times, we all feel depressed. But there is a difference between clinical depression and then maybe social anxiety or generalized anxiety, or some of the other social phobias and things like that that we may have. And so these websites kind of give you the criteria that we as therapists are looking at. Again, I'm not telling anyone to go and diagnose themselves, but just to get a better understanding, because just because you experience anxiety, just because you experience depression, those things are all very normal human emotional responses. But there is a different experience with those things that may cause someone to qualify for a clinical diagnosis versus I'm just having a normal emotional reaction to something. And then there's a few books I really love to read. So there is the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. And that one also shares just a lot of information around Black mental health, some of the things that are more specific to our culture. And so I think that has been a very helpful tool in just kind of understanding more about mental health and even about your own. And then if anyone is more interested in like trauma and learning about trauma, My Grandmother's Hand is a really good book about like complex trauma. And then for any of the different modalities, like there's Brain Spotting, which the book is just called Brain Spotting, but it's a very easy to read, easy to digest book. And so that can help someone to really find out, like, is brain spotting, beneficial for me? And I think that sometimes that's a little bit easier opposed to just going and trying it out, because you're probably going to spend more money and time in session versus if I go and buy this $10 or $15 book and read it. But then it also helps to prepare, because with a lot of these modalities, especially brain spotting, there's a learning curve involved. And so I feel like if you know more about the approach, it just helps you to know what you're going to expect in session and kind of have an idea if this is for you or not. And then there's obviously books on internal family systems. Another good thing with internal family systems, while there's definitely benefit to doing this with a therapist, because I've done both. I've read the book and used the workbook, and then I've also been in therapy with an IFS therapist. Some people have just gained some improvement from, because maybe, again, they don't have the resources for a therapist. Maybe they don't have the money, maybe they don't have the insurance, completely understandable. If that is the case, then being able to go on Amazon and you can just order the workbook, and it will kind of take you through step by step of different things, exercises you can do at home, of starting to really dive deep within yourself and understand the various parts of yourself. And so I think workbooks are always a great resource for anyone that maybe isn't at a point to where they're ready to do the work in therapy, but they want to start something at home. If you can do both, I think both is best practice. Yeah.
So Alicia, this has been so great to talk to you and get some of the questions we had been getting from our community answered. So if folks want to be in touch with you or find out more about you, where can they find you?
So I have a Psychology Today profile, which you can just go to psychologytoday.com/Alicia Gentry, and that'll tell you a little bit about myself, some of the modalities that I specialize in, some of the populations that I serve. But you can also use that as well to find other therapists as well. It's just a great resource for finding therapists in our area, and you can filter based on insurance, you can filter based on what your mental health need is. But then another way you can find me is on my website, which is InnerWorkCounselingLLC.com. And that'll just kind of piggyback off of my profile and just share a little bit more about Inner Work Counseling and just some of the work that we're doing, some of the other therapists that I have there at my practice. So yeah, those would probably be the best ways to get a hold of me.
So thank you all for spending this time listening to our conversation. We hope that you use this conversation as a tool to have conversations with loved ones and friends and family in the community. And we look forward to continue having conversations with you. Well,
Yes.
We can bring you back for another one.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you.